In the ancient world, the animal a king rode was not a detail, it was a declaration. A horse announced war, conquest, military power. A donkey announced peace, service, arrival without threat. Every inhabitant of Jerusalem knew this. And yet, when Jesus came down the Mount of Olives on that donkey, the crowd shouted exactly the wrong word for completely the wrong reason. You need to understand the context to grasp the magnitude of what happened that Sunday. Jerusalem, in the year Jesus made his entry, was not just any city in just any week. It was the Jewish Passover. And during Passover, the population of the city exploded in a way that modern historians still debate, but that the numbers make clear in any calculation. First-century Jerusalem had between 40 and 50,000 permanent inhabitants, a considerable number by the standards of antiquity. But during Passover, pilgrims from across the Jewish world converged on the holy city, from Babylon, from Alexandria, from Anatolia, from the coast of Spain, from Rome. Jews living in the diaspora who had saved money all year to make the journey at least once in their lives. Conservative estimates put that additional number at 100,000 pilgrims. More generous estimates reach 300,000. The city literally overflowed with people. In that context, any movement that drew attention was amplified in a way impossible to reproduce outside that specific time of year. A man entering the city mounted on an animal and being greeted by a crowd was not just a local event. It was a spectacle witnessed by people from dozens of different countries, each one carrying that memory back to their communities when they returned home. Whoever planned that entry knew exactly the effect it would produce, and the choice of animal was not accidental. It was the most precise and most meaning-laden declaration that could possibly be made in that moment. To understand what was being declared, you need to go back roughly 500 years before that Sunday. The prophet Zechariah wrote during the period of Israel's restoration after the Babylonian exile. It was a moment of fragile reconstruction, of cautious hope, of a people trying to rebuild the temple and their national identity after decades of humiliation. And in that context, Zechariah wrote one of the most specific, most detailed, and most literally fulfilled prophecies in all of the Hebrew Bible. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Every word of that text was known by heart by the scholars of Scripture. The king, righteous, salvation, humble, mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. It was not metaphor. It was not vague poetic language about some indeterminate future. It was a physical description with specific details about animals, of a real entry into a real city. And when Jesus sent two of his disciples to find exactly that animal in a village on the other side of the Mount of Olives, he was doing something far more complex than securing a mount. He was activating a 500-year-old prophecy before the eyes of a city full of people who knew that prophecy by heart. The village in question was Bethphage. It lay on the road between Bethany, where Jesus had spent the last days before his entry into Jerusalem, and Jerusalem itself. It was a journey of roughly 3 kilometers between the crest of the Mount of Olives and the city walls. A descent along a path that offered one of the most dramatic views in the ancient Middle East. The Kidron Valley to the left, the Temple Mount ahead, and the Golden City opening up in terraces and walls, in a panorama that was the spiritual destination of every pilgrim who had walked hundreds of kilometers to be there. Jesus sent 2 disciples with specific instructions. They would find a donkey tied up, a colt that had never been ridden. If anyone asked what they were doing, they were to say the Master needed it. And the Gospels record that this is exactly what happened. The colt was there. Someone asked. The answer worked. the animal was handed over. The detail that the colt had never been ridden is not a minor point. In the religious system of the Old Testament, animals intended for sacred functions had to be animals that had never been used for common purposes. A virgin animal, in the technical sense, was an animal that had served no previous purpose. The colt chosen for that entry was not a working animal repurposed for the occasion. It was an animal that, according to the gospel records, had been prepared specifically for that moment, waiting unridden until the hour arrived. When the disciples brought the donkey, they placed their cloaks on the animal to serve as an improvised saddle. And Jesus mounted. The descent from the Mount of Olives began, and it was here that the event took on a dimension that no human planning could have fully orchestrated. The crowd began to form along the road. Pilgrims who had arrived early, residents of Bethany who knew Jesus, people who had heard about the miracle that had happened in that very village just days before. When a man named Lazarus had come out of a tomb alive after 4 days dead, that story had circulated throughout the entire region. In terms of impact, it was the kind of story that spread by word of mouth at a speed that the communication systems of antiquity were surprisingly efficient at transmitting. Merchants, pilgrims, travelers, everyone was talking about what had happened in Bethany. And now, the man who had done that was coming down the Mount of Olives on a donkey, headed toward Jerusalem the day before the official start of Passover week. The scene created its own momentum. People on the road began removing their cloaks and spreading them on the ground. It was the oldest gesture of royal recognition in the Middle East. When Jehu had been proclaimed king of Israel centuries before, his soldiers had spread cloaks on the ground before him. It was a language everyone understood. Others cut palm branches. The Gospels record both those who went ahead and those who followed behind, creating a procession that grew as the group descended toward the city. And then came the shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" That word, Hosanna, is where the narrative begins to become more complex than it appears on the surface. Hosanna comes from the Hebrew Hoshiana, which literally means "save now," or "we ask you to save." It is an exclamation of urgent supplication, not of quiet celebration. In the Jewish liturgical context, it was a formula that appeared in Psalm 118, the great Passover psalm. Everyone there knew that formula. Everyone who had made the pilgrimage to the temple at previous feasts had sung that psalm in the temple. Hosanna was the cry of the psalm that preceded entry into the sanctuary. But in the context of that specific crowd, the shout carried an additional layer that went far beyond the liturgical. Son of David was a title, and not just any title. It was the messianic title par excellence. David had been the warrior king who transformed Israel into a regional power. David had defeated the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Arameans. David had expanded Israel's borders to the greatest extent the kingdom ever reached. And God's promise to David, recorded in the second book of Samuel, was that one of his descendants would sit on the throne forever. The Messiah, in the popular Jewish imagination of the first century, was the son of David, who would come to restore exactly that political and military glory. Drive out the Romans, re-establish the kingdom, sit on the throne of Jerusalem. When the crowd shouted Hosanna to the Son of David, they were shouting, "Save us now, restoring King." And they were expecting the man on the donkey to reveal himself as the general who had come to change the course of Israel's political history. But there was a fundamental problem with that reading, and the problem lay exactly in the animal Jesus had chosen to ride. The Roman Empire also had its rituals for entering cities. They called it the Triumph, and it was one of the most elaborate ceremonies in Roman culture. A victorious Roman general entered Rome on a white horse, his head crowned with laurels, his face painted red to symbolize the power of Mars, god of war. Before him marched the captured prisoners, the plundered wealth, the trophies of the campaign. Behind came the army, singing victory hymns. And in the middle of all this, according to Roman tradition, a slave stood behind the general in the same chariot, repeatedly whispering in his ear, "Remember that you are mortal." The horse was the central symbol of all of this. Conquering power, dominating force. The visual language of the Roman triumph was universal in that century's world. Every inhabitant of a city that had watched the legions pass knew what a general on horseback meant. But there was another precedent that Jews knew far better than the Roman triumph. It was in the scriptural records themselves. When David was old and it was time to choose his successor, one of the central questions was which of his sons would be anointed king. The choice fell on Solomon, and the records of 1 Kings describe the anointing scene with a specific detail. David ordered that Solomon be mounted on his own royal mule and led to the spring of Gihon to be anointed there. The mule, the donkey, was the animal of the king in peace, the animal of legitimate authority that did not need to prove its power through force of arms, the animal of the king who came to serve, not to conquer. The contrast between the two symbol systems was total. The Roman horse spoke of imposed power. The Davidic donkey spoke of received authority. And the question that procession descending the Mount of Olives placed before any observer who knew how to read both languages was simple and devastating at the same time. What kind of king is this? You can see then the double layer of what was happening on that road from Bethphage. For anyone who knew Zechariah, Jesus was fulfilling the prophecy to the letter. For anyone who knew the story of Solomon, he was using the language of the legitimate king anointed in peace. For anyone who knew the symbolism of the ancient world, he was making the opposite declaration to the Roman triumph. And for anyone who knew Psalm 118, he was staging the processional entry to the temple with a precision impossible to ignore for any scholar of Scripture. But the crowd was reading all of this through the filter of 150 years of foreign occupation. Before the Romans, the Seleucids; before the Seleucids, the Ptolemies; before the Ptolemies, Alexander's Macedonians; and before all of that, the Babylonians, who had destroyed the first temple and led the people into exile. The history of Israel in the centuries before that Sunday was a history of accumulated humiliation, of the briefest independence under the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans, of a national project that had never fully managed to re-establish itself. The wound was deep, the expectation of restoration was urgent, and the man who had raised Lazarus in Bethany seemed finally to be the agent of that restoration. When the Pharisees saw that procession descending the Mount of Olives and heard the shouts of the crowd, they came to Jesus with a simple demand. "Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Tell them to be quiet." Because what was happening there was, in the most direct possible reading, a public proclamation of kingship, and proclaiming a kingship alternative to the Roman emperors was the kind of thing that brought legions. The Pharisees, whatever their theological motivations, were right in their political reading of the moment. This looked exactly like the beginning of an uprising. Jesus' response was one of the densest sentences in the entire gospel narrative. "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out." It was not poetic rhetoric. It was the assertion that what was happening was not a movement that could be controlled by human voices. It was the fulfillment of something that had been written 500 years earlier. And stones that cry out are not silenced by anyone's command. The procession continued descending. And then something happened that the Gospels record with a care that suggests the disciples only understood its importance after everything was over. When Jesus reached the point on the road from which the entire city became visible, he stopped, and he wept over it. The Greek text uses a specific word denoting convulsive weeping, different from quiet tears. a weeping of visceral depth. And after weeping, he spoke words that the inhabitants of Jerusalem could not hear in that moment, because they were busy shouting Hosanna around him. If you, even you, had known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. And they will tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. 40 years later, this would become one of the most literally fulfilled prophecies in history. The Roman general Titus would surround Jerusalem with exactly the structures described. The city would be taken after a siege that produced a famine so severe that the accounts of the historian Flavius Josephus make difficult reading even for those accustomed to war narratives. The temple would burn in flames in a summer month. The stones would be torn down one from another to extract the gold that had melted and run between them during the fire. It was exactly what had been said at that point on the road 40 years before, while the crowd was shouting, Hosanna. But that Sunday, the crowd had no way of knowing that. The crowd wanted the king, and the king had arrived. The procession entered the city. The Gospels record that all of Jerusalem was shaken. The Greek word used shares its root with seismos, with earthquake. The city trembled with commotion. Who is this? Asked those who did not know. And the crowd answered, This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. The answer was revealing. Not this is the king, not this is the Messiah, the prophet. The highest status most people could attribute without directly affirming what the shout of Hosanna had already implied. Jesus went straight to the temple, and what he did there that same day or the following day, depending on which evangelist you read, was the act that made the week inevitable in a way that no donkey alone could have provoked. He overturned the tables of the money changers. He drove out those who sold doves. He said that his father's house had been turned into a den of robbers. It was an act of direct confrontation with the economic system that sustained the temple priesthood. The money changers were necessary because coins bearing the emperor's image could not be used to pay the temple tax, which had to be settled in sacred currency. The animal sellers were convenient for pilgrims who came from afar and could not bring their own animals on the journey. But the profit margin on those operations was extorted in a sacred space, and the man who had entered the city on a donkey had just declared war on that system with an action that anyone in the city could see and understand. That sealed the week. The religious authorities were already worried about Lazarus, already worried about the crowd, already worried about the Romans, who made a point of increasing their military presence in Jerusalem during Passover, precisely because the concentration of fervent pilgrims was exactly the kind of environment where messianic movements erupted frequently. Pontius Pilate himself had arrived in the city that week, not from Caesarea Maritima, where his usual residence was, but from where real power resided. Pilate had entered Jerusalem coming from the west, through the opposite gate, probably the same day or the day before Jesus' entry from the east. Pilate's entry was the Roman triumph in miniature. Horses, soldiers in gleaming armor, the apparatus of imperial power reminding everyone who held real authority over that city. The same Jerusalem, at the same time, had received two radically different entries. One entered on horseback, with armor, with the implicit message that Rome's power was watching any agitation. The other entered on a donkey, with pilgrims' cloaks on the ground, with the crowd singing a Passover psalm. The religious authorities calculated that they needed to act before the situation got out of hand. A decision had already been made that Jesus must die, recorded in the Gospels even before that week. But the method and the timing were the problem. Doing this during Passover, with all that crowd, was risking exactly the kind of disturbance the Romans would not tolerate, and that could sweep away the power structures that the high priesthood had carefully built within the occupation system. They needed someone from the inside, someone who knew Jesus's movements, someone who could identify a moment without a crowd, a moment of vulnerability. That person appeared. But that is another story. What matters for understanding the donkey entry is what happened between Sunday and Friday of that week, 5 days. On Tuesday, Jesus debated scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians in the temple, answering every theological trap they attempted to set before him with a precision that left them without response. He taught about the tribute to Caesar, about the resurrection, about the greatest commandment, about the nature of the Messiah and his relationship to David. Each answer dismantled the trap and exposed the incomprehension of whoever had asked. On Thursday evening, he celebrated the Passover with his disciples in an upper room somewhere in Jerusalem. In the early hours, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane on the very same Mount of Olives where he had descended triumphantly 5 days before. And on Friday morning, he stood before Pilate. The crowd that had shouted Hosanna on Sunday was shouting, "Crucify him" on Friday. That is a fact recorded by all 4 Gospels and is the most disturbing point in the entire narrative if you try to explain psychologically how a crowd does that in 5 days. But the explanation lies in the very ambiguity of the Hosanna shout. They were not worshipping, they were asking, "Save us now." And when it became clear that Jesus was not willing to be the messianic general they expected, that he had not raised an army, that he had not taken the Roman praetorium, that he had been arrested in the garden without resistance, the shout changed. Because the supplication had not been answered the way they expected, the donkey had been the warning, the clearest possible symbol that the kind of salvation arriving was not the kind of salvation they were requesting. But the crowd needed a sign it had already received and had not managed to read. There is a final layer of this narrative that scholars of the period tend to highlight, and that rarely appears in the more popular versions of the story. In the ancient world, one of the ways of declaring sovereignty over a territory was to traverse it. Kings marked the boundaries of their domains through physical journeys. Crossing a territory was a way of claiming it. When Jesus came down the Mount of Olives and crossed the Kidron Valley and entered through the city gate and went straight to the temple, he was doing exactly that, declaring that space belonged to him, that his authority over that place was prior to and superior to that of any Roman prefect or high priest appointed by Rome. And the animal he chose for that crossing carried with it the entire language of the king who comes in peace, the king who serves, the king that Zechariah had described with astonishing precision 500 years before. The horse would have been a declaration of war. The donkey was a declaration of purpose. And the difference between the two things is the difference between what the crowd wanted that Sunday and what that week truly was. There is still a final detail that most people telling this story leave aside, but that is essential for understanding the magnitude of what was being communicated. The book of Zechariah, the same one containing the prophecy of the humble king on the donkey, also contained other prophecies about the same figure. Zechariah described a shepherd betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, described a king who would look on the one who had been pierced, described fountains opened for cleansing, or it was as though the same text that announced the donkey entry already knew where that week was headed. The triumphal entry and the Passion Week were not separate events. They were the first and the last chapters of a single movement that Zechariah had glimpsed from 500 years away. The Mount of Olives witnessed all of this, the descent on the donkey on Sunday, the agonized prayer on Thursday night. And it is the same Mount of Olives that appears in another textual tradition, in the book of Acts, as the place from which a cloud received him after the resurrection. with figures dressed in white, saying he would return in the same way he had departed. The hill that witnessed the humble entry was the same that witnessed the departure. And the tradition, waiting for the return places that return again in the same place. But all of that is later. That specific Sunday, what existed was a man coming down a hill on an animal that every inhabitant of Jerusalem knew the meaning of, with a crowd shouting a word whose real significance was not aligned with what they expected to happen. Heading toward a week that none of them could fully predict, every generation since that Sunday has had to answer the same question that crowd did not know how to answer. It is not an abstract theological question. It is the most practical question there is. What kind of salvation are you asking for? The crowd in Jerusalem wanted political liberation, economic restoration, national independence. They wanted the man on the donkey to transform himself into the general who never appeared. When the general did not come, the disappointment was deep enough for the same voice that had shouted Hosanna to shout something else on Friday morning. Jesus did not ride a war horse, not because he could not, but because the problem he came to solve was deeper than any Roman occupation, older than any political oppression, more urgent than any generational crisis. The donkey was the answer to a question the crowd had not yet learned to ask. The answer arrived before the question, and that is one of the most silent and most devastating forms of incomprehension that exists. 2,000 years later, the animal still asks the same silent question to anyone who stops to look at it. What are you asking for? And do you know the difference between what you want and what you need?